Middle of November 2011 already, and time flies when you're having fun. I guess we had a lot of fun this year because the year is waning very quickly. We got in our cars and traveled a little longer than Calvin and David Patrick did today, but we're in Champlain at Celine Paquette's wonderful Samuel de Champlain History Center. I love this building, David, don't you?
Yeah, I love it too. It's a really nice building, built 1880, and a very sturdy building.
Just so great when people have, I'm so pleased when people have vision, using history to form what they do today and build something that'll be here for a long time to come. This was a bank when it was built. Celine bought it. A few years after 1880, they built a second floor on it, right?
Yeah,
Dave?
it was. The bank was established, I think, 1860s, and I don't know where it was. And 1880, they built the first story, and it was used for many years. And in 1905, Hugh McClellan, who was the architect of the Samuel D. Champlain monuments, as well as the school here in Rouses Point and Champlain, added the second story, and that's 1905. He also did renovation on the Knights of Columbus building next door, 1909. So there's a lot of history, and the bank was around, I don't know, probably until the 50s or 60s before it folded. And this building here has had many different uses over the last 100 or so years.
So Celine bought it,
Yeah.
she took over the reformation, if you will, of the building, and I love its use now. I like the building. It has a good feel about it, and she's done a very tasteful job in restoring it, hasn't she?
A lot of effort's been put into making sure, there's, the wood matches new wood matches the old wood, and it's a very picturesque building.
That's really nice. For those people who've never met David Patrick, we've done several shows with him, and if we live long enough, we'll do several more.
Yeah,
we have had
more.
some fun, David,
Yeah,
haven't we?
it's been great.
Historic places like Point of Fair, boy, isn't it a wonderful spot?
Point of Fair, a very historic site. I like it a lot.
Yeah. Your family has a lot to do with the history of this North Country, doesn't it?
Yeah, well, I'm related to Pliny Moore, who was the person that got the land grant, what was called the Mooresville Grant, Smith and Gray's patent, and that's basically where the entire village of Champlain is in. He built the house that's across the street, although it burned down, but it's a replica, and that was he built that 1801, and there's a lot of history around here, and I'm related to the Nyes, who built the Savoy building. They built the Champlain house and the Champlain Hall, which is still present, and as well as a few other buildings around town. Unfortunately, everyone is long gone, and all we have right now is just records and photographs left.
So your interest and your passion for history is almost genetic, isn't it?
Yeah, well, I always started this project, 15 years ago as a genealogy project, trying to figure out who I was related to, and it's migrated to, town of Champlain history, because the same people who I'm related to were very instrumental in the growth of the village, and they left a record that I've been working on, and that's how the calendars came about 10 years ago. This is my 10th calendar. And
is that possible?
Yeah, I don't know how it is, because I remember talking about the first one, whether I should do it, and my idea back then was to try to take the photographs that I had access to and portray them in a large format versus a small 4x5, picture in a book. And so I had the idea of a calendar, and started off with a small essay. And over the years, the essays went from 3 pages to 7,
yes, they
to
did.
11, and this
Pretty
one
soon we'll have to have an addendum hanging down on
this will be a book, yeah.
Yeah.
So as someone said one time, it's a calendar, it's a small book masquerading as a calendar.
It really is.
Yeah.
And if you were to put all your research into every one and print it out in the calendar, it would be 4 inches thick.
Yeah, and
because I know how much time you spend on this.
Yeah,
project.
3 or 4 months, and I do all the layout, and I try to use a lot of primary sources of information, which is usually more accurate than hearsay.
Every town should have somebody like you, David, who takes enough interest in it to put something like this together each year, and we do have some historic calendars in other towns in
Yeah.
the North Country, and we, Hometown Cable, Calvin Castine and me and you and so many other people take pride in the history of these little towns.
Yeah.
And as I've said 1,000 times before, we don't know where we're going until we know where we've been.
And that's what I do with these calendars. I don't necessarily know what I'm going to do next year. It just kind of evolves. And if I work on something over the winter, and I may decide, hey, this is probably good for next year's calendar, and then later on these calendars, the information I use kind of migrates into other projects. So like the Dewey's Tavern event, where I was able to put some information from the previous calendars into my Dewey's Tavern event and the little speech that I do there. And all these other projects like the Point of Fur one, which I worked on some years ago, that migrated into the the dedication of that a site and the burial of the soldier back in 2009. So that's all based on some of this footwork that I've been doing, and then I decide that now is the time to publish it or go public with it and do something with it, and that's how it's always been.
It always pleases me when you can preserve history. And each one of these calendars for the last 10 years is a piece of history itself.
Yeah.
And so you look back through this and you see a prism that takes you back a long, long ways.
Yeah.
And each one of these is a collector's item, and I'm proud to say that. Well, let's show a picture of it, then we'll pause for a moment, and this will be a very interesting program. You can get your pencil and paper if you want to and take notes, because this will be a real history lesson. Stay tuned. David, at what point do you decide during the year, okay, this is going to be my theme for the next calendar?
Well, the theme is usually based on, there's two parts of the calendar. There's the photographs, which I use 13 high quality photographs, and I could be changing the photographs up until the day I print. I mean, moving them around. There's been a few times where I've actually, like the St. Mary's photograph, which was in last year's calendar of the wooden church, which was an amazing picture because not many people have seen it. I found a very good quality image of it because everything else I'd seen was very, very, photocopy of a photocopy of a photocopy, and I found a print. And literally at the last, just a day before I was to print, I switched photographs and used that as my cover photographs. So I don't really know, over the period of a few months, I figure out what photos I have, which are good for the main photographs, and which are good for the insets if they're real small, and then once I decide, then I have to spend a good amount of time trying to research the photographs and write a little history more than just a few lines. I try to avoid saying something like, this is Main Street in 1907, one line. I try to, that's it's too easy to do that. So what I try to do is write a little history about something related to the buildings or the people or, way back when.
So how did you settle on historic essay, the town of Champlain's lost burying yard?
Yeah, well, that's the essay is the second half of the calendar, and I had been working literally when I was saying earlier. I usually work on various projects over the winter, etc. And I don't really know where I'm going to go with these projects. And for the this winter, I guess, this past year, I was compiling up a large document on exactly this subject, trying to put everything together I could find on the different burying yards. Most of it was compiled by the McClellans when they did the cemetery records.
Yep.
And not only that, they were doing the cemetery records in the 1930s, and Hugh actually started in 1917 they went up with Woody and Huldah in the 1960s. So they were mentioning all these different burying yards. So last year at this time, middle of November, Celine Paquette and we went around town trying to find some of the more obscure ones, and
there are some,
and there's definitely some obscure ones, and we were able to find them and take photographs of them, and some of them were in some pretty bad state. Other ones were similar to what Hugh saw back in 1930s. So I was trying to find the different burying yards that they found and wrote about that in a bigger document, and then decided to use that as my essay. And unfortunately, I had so much material that I actually had to add an extra page to the calendar, which is really four different one sheet, which is 4 pages, just to add the maps and the pictures I had.
You know, that's a topic that comes up often, and I'm sure people who watch this program with David Patrick, myself, and Calvin Castine behind the camera will say to yourself, wait a minute, we've got some of those so-called lost burial grounds in our neighborhood. And somebody approached me the other day on the street and said, what can we do about that? We have seen a few of the lost burial grounds that have been recovered.
Yeah.
Historical societies, sometimes the Red Hatters,
Eagle Scouts.
Eagle Scouts, people who aren't even from this area studying history at the college or whatever, or just plain townspeople will take it upon
But
themselves
it could also be the descendants of some of these people who.
because many of them are family cemeteries.
Yeah, family cemeteries. Like,
So what's your suggestion to people who come across a cemetery in a field somewhere and they have a descendant buried there and it's in terrible shape?
yeah, I mean, there's a couple of types of cemeteries around. A lot of the cemeteries are on private property, and like in fields and stuff like that. So I would talk to the landowner about what could be done, if anything. A few other burial grounds, I don't know if they're on private property or not, but the town of Champlain actually maintains some of these burial grounds where they'll go in and maybe twice a year and mow the grass and just keep it relatively up to date. But then there's other ones that are just completely abandoned. No one even knows that a cemetery is there, and there's a few places around town that I can clearly say that there's no trace of it, and no one would have known that even it existed if it hadn't been for letters and pictures that I have.
And that's sad.
It's just
You would love
unfortunately.
to be able to pay your respect to these people, even though they're not. You're not a descendant of these people, because it's just a shame. I feel bad when I drive by a cemetery and see gravestones broken on the ground, half buried,
Yeah.
and growth all over the place.
And there's people living today who are related to those people. They may not
Absolutely.
know it. They may be living, in another part of the country, and no one really knows who's there, or they just maybe know they're from Champlain area and way back in the genealogy. But a lot of these places, I'm pretty sure that a lot of people don't know even exists on their property, and people knew 70 years ago, 40 years ago. And
People knew where Pike's Cantonment was 100 years ago, and
Yeah.
then they lost it for a long time.
Yeah.
That happens.
Unfortunately, you need, good documentation. You need maps. Someone had to do that 200 years ago and have it survive for you to find it. And the McClellans did a reasonably good job because a lot of the cemeteries were still intact. Back in the 20s and 30s and 40s.
Thank God
but,
for that information, that
Yeah.
archive, huh?
But today, with houses being built, et cetera, on the side of the road and fields, things have changed.
So you and Celine had a good time.
Yeah, that was last year where we actually went around. I had a list of cemeteries, and we went around, kind of rediscovered what was kind of known by a few people, but not really commonly known.
So maybe, just maybe, in the course of this program, we can inspire people to check some of these old cemeteries and maybe get a community effort underway to at least clean them up a little bit and rehabilitate them.
Yeah, I mean, some of them really need some work, and other ones I don't think will ever be, if it's just fragments of stone around. But the best you could do is just block it off and keep it mowed.
But it's hard to believe, for some people viewing this program, that there are burying yards, as you call them, which are lost forever,
Yeah.
which you don't see any trace of, which may be part of a farmer's field.
Yeah, and my other concern is, I think there's a lot of burials around town on the old farms that have zero record. We'll talk about it later, but a lot of people died of typhus during the War of 1812 townspeople, and I hear 30 or 40 people died, and I only find one or two in the cemeteries with those dates on them. And I suspect a lot of people were just buried behind their houses and in the fields and
That's
200 years
probably
ago.
true.
Yeah. No record.
Stillborn babies were very often buried right in the cellar of the house, in the dirt floor, underneath the house.
So there's zero record of that, and you'll never find anything.
So anyway, how did you choose the cover picture?
So we'll go through the the 13 big images and.
Why this one for the cover?
I chose this one for the cover because it was a very good picture. I always try to pick something that's eye-catching, nostalgic, and the quality of the image is excellent.
Oh,
and what
you
this
see
is,
details. Every
Yeah.
time you look at it
Yeah.
again, you see a new detail.
yeah, and what it is, it's the old railroad depot in Champlain, which was on the corner of Butternut and Chestnut Streets, which used to be called Matilda Street, and it was I'm not sure when it was built, but it was around up until the 1970s, and by that time it wasn't being used. But the railroad was very big in Champlain and Rouses Point. I give a little brief history of it, and in 1850 the railroad was established in Champlain between Rouses Point and Ogdensburg, and Rouses Point and Champlain saw considerable growth after the railroad was established, or actually, during the construction. The Champlain house, which burned in 2003, was built by Bartlett Nye because of the railroad, and a lot of downtown was built because of the railroad. And the same with Rouses Point was a depot there. They had machine works there, so they saw a lot of growth in Rouses Point because of the railroad.
Railroad had to do with everything.
Yeah, and that was the main transportation back then.
All right, we open the calendar, and we see a beautiful view of.
Yeah.
You got a lot of snow scenes in your calendars.
Well,
It's kind of cool, isn't it?
I always try to do January, February as snow scenes.
Well, of course.
Of course. So there's not a lot of snow scenes around. So but so far I've been able to put them in. And this shows Main Street looking east toward the Champlain Telephone Company up the hill. And the building actually on the right, American House, is still present today. They renovated the outside quite a bit, but it's still there. And the buildings all on the left, where the Albert K. groceries are, burned down in the 1960s in a huge fire. And what this shows is a man shoveling snow. And at this time you don't see any motorized cars, although at the time the photograph was taken, there were a few cars driving around, automobiles. But right now it's mostly sleds that you can see.
I love the sleds. I love it. And you show some various views of the Champlain Depot.
Yeah, one was when it was being used around 1900. Then the two other ones when it was in a dilapidated situation. And the little print there says Railroad Festival, June 13, 1850. That's basically celebrating the opening of the railroad. So we have a couple of good dates there, concrete dates of when the railroad actually opened up in Champlain.
Talk about rehabilitating graveyards, burying yards. Some townspeople in various communities are rehabilitating their railroad stations, and I
Yes,
like
they
to
are.
see that too.
Like in Chazy.
Yeah,
Yeah.
various communities all around the North Country and elsewhere. Of course, we mentioned before, railroads were the focal point
Yeah.
of life in those communities.
It was very, they went all over the place, and it was very easy to drive, take transportation down from Champlain down to, say, New York City or Boston.
I love old cars. Everybody loves old cars.
Yeah.
So February is especially
Yeah.
neat for me.
Now, February is also a winter scene. I should say a lot of my photographs in this calendar here are based on Bert F. Payne, B.F. Payne's photographs. And Payne was a photographer, and we'll talk about it in a few minutes. He had a couple studios on Main Street. And he took a lot of these photographs, and I was fortunate enough to be able, he actually made postcards of a lot of these photographs, but I was actually able to use some of his original negatives to make the prints, so that's why the quality of
Are they glass plate negatives?
No, they're celluloid.
Oh, they are?
Yeah, they date to around 1909, 1908.
They were in good enough shape?
Yeah, so I was able to scan those photographs, or the negatives versus the the prints that you may find on eBay or something like that. But a lot of his photographs are of pictures around town, and he used a lot of his photographs have his car in it, and I figured that one out. He was very big into.
No wonder the car shows up often.
He was very big into, being. He was big into cars. He was probably Champlain's first car dealer, and he went through a lot of cars. Used to go to car shows. So what I found was, if you look closely, you'll always be able to find his car in one of the pictures, one of 2 or 3 cars. Now, the picture here in February is not him. It's someone else. I'm not sure who it is, but that's definitely his car, or had been. I know he sold it. And the little inset photograph shows 4 people in it, but the driver's seat, the person's not sitting in it, and that's probably because that was the photographer who was taking the photo. So that's definitely Payne's car. I have no idea where this photograph was taken, but it is labeled as Champlain. And further,
It is hard to tell, isn't it, when the buildings are gone?
well, this building here, none of these buildings really stand out, and it could be anywhere, but you can see at the bottom it's labeled Champlain. Now, on the bottom here and on the insets, there was a photograph that I used, I don't know when it was, 2006 calendar, picture taken on Maple Street and Oak Street of 3 people in a car. Well, I figured out now that person is Payne, Bird F. Payne. So when you see, B.F. Payne Studios, that's him. He lived actually right around there on Maple Street and Oak Street, and that's his wife and probably mother or mother-in-law in the car.
I'll tell you, every time I look at those, like that inset on the top that we showed, I think of Laurel and Hardy.
Yeah, I do.
Do you?
Actually,
When you see the hats, you think of Laurel and Hardy.
Yeah.
And now I'm so excited. This has nothing to do with the history of Champlain, except that it's something that jumped into my mind. I'm glad it did yours, and now you can get a whole collection of all the Laurel and Hardy movies and shorts, because I grew up with them.
Yeah,
of course.
and Payne was, as I said, the first car dealer. He was buying and selling cars, and I found a lot of newspaper clippings in the newspapers, like in Malone. And he also was into gas-powered yachts, which was probably
Oh,
new.
no kidding.
Yeah, that's a picture of a yacht, which
On
was
the bottom there, yeah.
on a postcard, no less. Showing, and I realized it was him. It says Bird F. Payne Champlain.
You're for people who want to buy this calendar, and we suggest they do. How many are sold every year, by the way?
About a couple hundred, 150,
Are they really?
200, yeah,
And that's about what you like? Would you
Well,
like to see 500?
No, I'd like to see 300, but I'll take.
Well, who knows? Maybe.
I print about 300, but I sell about 150 or so.
Well, we've got a wider audience every year now, thanks to the internet.
Yeah.
So people can order these. Can they order them online?
Well, you can order them. You can contact me and through email or through Celine's office here, or you can go to a number of different places in town. I'll give you the list. You can go to the Kinney Drugs in here in Champlain.
Right.
You go to Cornerstone Gift Shop in Rouses Point. The town and village offices. Here, the Champlain Memorial Library, Conroy's, Cornerstone Bookshop in Plattsburgh. They all have and Celine's History Center here.
And for people who would like to order online who are watching this in Tuskegee, Alabama, or somewhere,
They would send me an email, and
what's your email address?
DASP, that's twice, at hotmail.com. And
Well,
or
easy,
you go to their. That's probably the best way. It's the DASP. Yeah.
Well, this whole thing is jammed with history, and every single month you try to get some things that are interesting. You got a little ad for the
Yeah.
Malone farmers, You got little historic notes from each day in the month or
Yeah,
several days in
and
the
that's,
month.
I always try to do that, and every few years I change the happenings, and this year is mostly new happenings, and so I try to put down significant events for a particular day.
Just so people know. And I want them to appreciate the hard work that goes into forming this calendar. It isn't just a matter of you going to a library somewhere or opening up a website and the stuff is all lined up for you. It requires a great deal of planning and thought.
Yeah, I mean, I don't, like the essay took 6 months to work on, and then I condensed that down, starting in July. But the actual process of the calendar is probably takes about 3 months, and it's all me working on it. So
Okay, let's turn to March. There are people watching this will say, oh my gosh, they had floods back in those days?
yeah,
Well,
March I always put a flood picture in because March and April have always been the time when Champlain in the past was prone to major floods. Fortunately, they haven't really had too many now. But back in 1908, 1909, 1911 was the biggest one. They did have some big floods, and as you can see here, these ice sheets are about 2 feet thick, flowing through downtown, Main Street.
yeah, a lot of people swallowed hard when they saw this picture, I'm sure, and remember, because we've had some tough times in the last couple of years in various months in the year,
Yeah.
all the way up through April. So,
Yeah, unfortunately, a lot of the only building standing today in that photograph is the one that says Champlain Hall.
right in the
That
middle.
was built by Bartlett and I, my ancestor. The one sister building was taken down a few years ago or a year ago, and then to the right or to the left of it was the Doolittle building, which is taken down in the 1970s.
And as you said before, the post office has had many
Yeah,
locations
the
on
post
Main
office
Street.
has been all over the place, and it was in one of these buildings here. It was across the street, and another building, and it's been about 3 or 4 locations on Main Street.
It was always important then, and it is now, as we look at the bottom of this page, to know when the ice goes out.
Yeah, and a couple years ago, I put in one set of numbers or dates, and I found some more information, and was able to put in additional dates and corroborate the first dates. And I think it's probably nice to know, people, to get an idea of when, sometimes there was very cold winters, and sometimes there was, things thawed out early on. And you
Well,
can
if
see that.
you subscribe to the theory of global warming, maybe you can mark on your own calendar when there are lots of people that have little lotteries and games on both sides of
Oh,
the
yeah,
lake
yeah,
and
right.
put a giant cave, for example,
Yeah.
in the pond in
I think
front of
there's
the
like Joe's
CDPH.
Pond or something. in
Yeah,
Vermont.
and so it'll be interesting to know when the ice goes out. And so mostly it was March and April, wasn't
Yeah,
it, in
yeah.
those days?
Yeah. And it varied widely.
Sometimes it's hard for you to get a calendar in there. You get
I
so
know.
much information.
That's why they say it's a book. It's a calendar, a book masquerading as a calendar.
It's wonderful. The history itself pleases me a great deal, and
Yeah.
the fact that somebody like you takes the time to learn history. You don't even live here right now, do you?
Well, I live nearby, but yeah,
Yeah.
the family's here, and I got quite a number of people buried here.
These towns are absolutely incredible. Talk a little bit about this picture in
Yeah,
April.
this is a bizarre picture. It actually shows a bear gnawing on a wooden pole, and he's held by a rope by a handler, and he's sitting basically in front of on Main Street by the Champlain house, right where the bridge is, and a lot of children are all walking around looking at the bear. I do not believe it's a person dressed in a bear costume. I don't think a person would be gnawing on a wooden pole. But back in those
Well,
days,
you hope not, anyway.
yeah,
Well, yeah, there were dancing bears and intelligent pigs and various farm animals that were trained
Yeah.
to do things in the streets and so on, and we enjoyed them all.
yeah, and I think in those days there wasn't really as much regulation too. So if someone had a pet bear, they were able to, take it around and show the kids.
As I mentioned before, but I want to reiterate, these photographs are so good that you can stare at them for a long time and find a new nuance somewhere in a corner.
Yeah, and what's great, especially on the computer, you can zoom in and look at more detail than you could
That's
here
fun,
on
isn't
the,
it?
yeah. And I do that now and then. Even I'll show you in December where I zoom in and get a better image of some people.
Note the wooden sidewalks.
Yeah, everything is wooden and it looks like it's on stone underneath.
So is there anything left of that area, that corner?
Well, unfortunately, the house that you see there was burned down in 2003, and it's basically an open lot right now, and the elm trees are long gone. So no, it's definitely changed.
And let's show the calendar itself in the ad that you put in there. You have to make choices on everything you put in here.
Yeah,
You put it there, then you revise it.
yeah, revise it. I just figure out what month it's going to go in. A lot of times I'll put some pictures on the insets that supplement the main photograph. But every now and then, if I don't have anything or if it's generic, I put in a poster or so.
Do you have an unlimited number of photographs so that because you're going to live to be 100 and something.
I could probably do 4 more years of this, but what's great is every few years then you find more, something else surfaces. And, theoretically you only need 13 good photographs, and then, you can use the poor images for the insets, as long as I can find very good quality photographs, I can write a history of something else, and I'll continue.
And if somebody is watching this and is meeting David Patrick for the first time, that's too bad because we've done this program every year since the beginning, I think, haven't we? Or most of them?
I think we've worked on most calendars, yeah.
Yeah.
A couple.
So let's say somebody is watching that and seeing you for the first time and they'd like to build a collection of these calendars. Do you have some old ones?
Oh yeah, and the old one, a lot of people collect these calendars, and
of course, I can understand why.
Yeah, I went to a high school reunion here in town last year, and I had brought a bunch of calendars, and I sold a few, but everyone I talked to already had them, and which was, I guess, a good thing.
That's a good feeling, isn't it?
But people do collect them because, again, these images. The images that are out there today are usually in postcards, and the quality of those postcards are, they're small pictures and they're poor quality. And in this calendar here, I used a lot of the original negatives to produce very high quality, reproductions.
So you didn't have to do much enhancing after you.
No, the quality of the negatives was excellent. So you scan them, and the quality is good.
It's fortunate that this town and many others had a local photographer.
Yeah, and we'll get to that in the December one, and because there's been several photographers in town, and that were able to take a lot of photographs, and a lot of those images have been preserved.
How many times do you suppose that Hometown Cable has shown a picture of this church, St. Mary's Church in Champlain? It's the church, the firehouse, the post office are generally places where people gather. St. Mary's Church has a long and rich history and boasts the very first Samuel de Champlain monument.
In 1907. So last year I actually did a history of the church, and which I mentioned before, and starting from the wooden church.
Yes,
that
you
was
did.
Actually the Methodist church, moved from southern part of Champlain town, and that was established 1860, and then 1885 I think it was, the stone church was built in its place. So usually in around I've used a lot of different photographs of St. Mary's, and in this photograph here there was actually 3 photographs that were similar, and this was taken by Payne, B.F. Payne. I know that because in another photograph, it shows from another direction, has a picture of his car in it.
Just outside the frame of this one on the right-hand side.
On the right-hand side. And then I found a third photograph here at the Celine's History Center of clearly the same ceremony, postcard with a date on it. So that's how I knew it was June 11th, 1910, Before that, I figured it was 1909, 1910, because he was taking photographs then. I'm not really sure what the ceremony is about. It could have been done in, I don't know, it's a lot of American flags hanging, and I'm not really sure what the ceremony is about, but it's a good photograph.
We're not even sure it was taken in May, do we?
Well, no, it says it was taken June 11th, 1910.
Oh, June 11th, I'm sorry.
Yeah,
Okay, June 11th, close
Yeah.
enough.
yeah,
You got another picture of St. Mary's Church with the calendar.
yeah, and that's
you really
that's,
you got the history packed into this page.
yeah. A lot of stuff happened in May over the 200 years.
That's always great to see, but you have to choose what
Yeah.
events you want to put on every
Yeah.
page because they're more than one thing.
Yeah, and like I said, this year it has a lot of new events that from last year.
Uh, and as I said at the outset, there are many towns and villages in New York State and elsewhere, wherever people might be watching this program, that have history.
Yeah,
And sadly, a lot of people just have no concept of what it takes to study the history of their town.
well, yeah.
And you've opened a lot of wonderful doors.
You got to
for us.
have sources of information, and then be able to connect the dots. And otherwise, it's just going to be just too much information, too much overload.
Is there enough of this kind of thing taught in our local schools, David?
I don't know. I know they talk a lot about state history, international history. I assume like the local schools here are maybe talking about the Battle of Plattsburgh a little bit, which of course Champlain was knee deep in.
Oh, I guess it was.
For 3 years.
That's where
yeah.
where it started,
That's
as far
where
as
it
I'm
started.
concerned.
We were invaded by the largest army, to evade the United States. I think went right through Champlain.
And many people who've heard us talk about this every year are just not aware of how huge that army was.
Yeah, I mean 10, 12,000 people marching over the border. Literally half the army marched right past this building here before it was built, but on the road.
Think about it.
Yeah,
Now we're approaching crescendo here in terms of the history of the Battle of Plattsburgh, or as Keith Hercolo calls them in his book, the Battles of Plattsburgh,
Yeah,
because there was
many
much
different-
more involved than just that naval battle, that brief naval battle on the Plattsburgh Bay.
3 hour battle. Yeah.
So, and each year we build up to the year 2014, which seems a lot closer now than it did when Calvin and I started talking about it back in the mid
Yeah,
90s.
2012 is when the war started, or 1812, but 2012 was the 200th anniversary.
So here we go. We're working, so many things happening around this time, and we're recording this in the middle of November in 2011 or 2011. I still don't know which. What do you say? Do you say 2011 or 2011?
I say 2011.
Do you?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to change. I've been saying 2011 up till now. Time for a change. Not you?
I'm staying with 20.
You're going to stay with 20, huh? It's a wonderful thing. We're going to pause for another moment, watching and listening to this very interesting historical perspective from David Patrick, who is a terrific local amateur historian who cares a great deal, not just about his family, but about the history of Champlain. All right, David, June is busting out all over. We flipped
Yeah.
the page. We're in the middle of the year. Tell us about this. Not a real picture.
It's not a real picture. It's a scan of a letterhead that I found here at the Samuel D. Champlain History Center that Celine had. And it shows the Champlain Agricultural Works, which was a business that was in business from 1820 to about 1905, 1908, a long time when they made plows. It was established by Noadiah Moore, my ancestor, and it was on by the riverbank on Main Street, where the it's just outside the on the west bank, I guess you could say. I think there was Champlain Laundry used to be there years ago.
Yep.
In that area. But it was a bunch of buildings, and they made all sorts of different plows and castings and horseshoes, etc., and harrows. So I actually went through the newspaper articles, and I found some letters, at various locations that discussed what the business did, and I tried to make a timeline or a little history of the business. and actually did come up with a good amount of material, and talking about who owned the business. It was owned by Noadiah Moore, but he died 1859. And then I went to his son, Samuel Maddox Moore, who built the house that it's a brick building off of, I think, Locust Street, as you're heading toward Perry's Mills. There's a red brick building there. He lived there, and he owned it for some years and then sold it to a Doolittle, Hiram Doolittle, and then Doolittle sold it to a guy named Graves. And by that time, early 1900s, they were, having financial problems, and, the building was, the business was slowly, being reduced in size. The problem that they had was a lot of machinery and stuff was coming from Canada at much cheaper prices than what they could, sell for over here. So they were getting undercut by the plows in Canada. So eventually the business folded.
I'm so interested in this history that I'm going to make a suggestion, and it's probably outside of my pay grade. But I would like to suggest that if they don't, any teachers watching this program who live in this area or teach in area schools would do well to take copies of this calendar into the classroom. I don't know what would be the optimum grade level, and spend a little time just going through this calendar with their classes. Don't you think that would be a great idea?
Definitely a lot of information, and I have maps in there. And one of the things I do like is these letterheads, which like we have here in the inset. It tells you everything about the company. And
absolutely terrific. And you want a picture of the plow? We got one of those here.
Yeah, and
I want to tell you that I was driving around the North Country and I looked for old farm machinery. Yeah. Because I know people who collect it.
That picture of the plow is taken out of a brochure too. So it's
I saw one on a front yard just about identical to that the other day.
That could be 1850s to 1870s. Who knows?
It's great because of course we talked about the railroad, but a town is also built around the various businesses that crop up.
Yeah.
And that's one that I had forgotten about or didn't know about. Champlain Agricultural Works.
Yeah, and it did employ a lot of workers at one time.
Oh, I love it when there's flags hanging up, and look at this one.
Yeah, this one's
We're in July.
It's a very nice photograph. I always try to put up a photograph with a lot of flags in it, if it's for the July 4th. And this shows, again, Main Street, Village of Champlain. And it's talking about, it's a sign that says baseball. Baseball was a very big event in Champlain in the early 1900s. There's a lot of rivalries going on about that. And then also in the Doolittle picture house there's the M.L. Wright's photographer. And he took a lot of these photographs after Payne left. And I'll mention that in December a little bit more. But Payne's studio was up there one time, and then it moved to another location. So,
and let's look at the calendar itself and the photographs. I love the whole concept of before and after.
Yeah.
And we had a good friend, the late Ron Venn, who almost made a life's work of going around and finding old photographs like this, try to find precisely what the perspective was of the original photographer. And he did it hundreds and hundreds of times and had a little history. And I'm sure you think about that every time you look at one of these pictures, right?
Yeah. And there's a lot of photographs I do, like in this one here in August, where I actually do have a current photograph. So this one here is because I'm doing this is not just the village of Champlain, it's the town. So I look at the different villages and hamlets. And now we're getting into some of the other places around town. This is Hotel Montgomery, Rouses Point, which was a large hotel built 1890, and it was on Pratt Street, right across from the railroad station, which is still standing. And three-story building. It was built because of the railroad, which was literally right there. The railroad tracks are off to the side. The tracks are still present today. In the photograph below, I took just a month ago. It shows more or less an open lot and a modern house a little bit to the left, and the railroad tracks again are still there. So no one would ever
Your
really.
nephew's house?
Yeah.
Really?
So no one would have known, before, today, without looking at a map, that there was such a large building present.
And I love it. Program, Rouses Point Bridge dedication and celebration.
Yeah, that was it was a program, more than one page, and it tells you when the bridge was opened, 1937, the older bridge.
And it just happened to be a month and a day after I was born. How do you like that? We've been talking, we're recording this in the middle of November 2011, and the reason I'm focusing on a bridge on that page and in general discussion is the fact that the new Champlain Bridge, or what I call the Crown Point Bridge,
Yeah.
is just reopened. So we've been talking a great deal about the Veterans Memorial Bridge up here,
Yeah.
Korean War Veteran Memorial Bridge, and various other bridges in the North Country. So that's cool.
And I think the Rouses Point Bridge was opened in '37, but then it was replaced in the 1980s.
Calvin was there.
Yeah.
Gordy Little was there not with a video camera though. You probably didn't have a video camera, did you?
87, yeah.
Yeah, 87. You were there. He was doing this for a few years
okay.
already.
Yeah.
Hey, we're turning the corner here.
Yeah, so
we're in September.
Now we're in Coopersville, and this is the Forsyth Hotel. That building is still present. It's owned by Suzanne Moore and her husband, and I actually asked her. She knew a lot about the history of the house, so I asked her if she would write something about the history. So I had two pictures, and if you flip the page in October, you'll actually see the same house from a different angle. And what I have here in this picture here, September,
On the bottom.
shows the current the house today, and you can see very little change has occurred, except for some of the porch. But there's a lot of history to this hotel.
Isn't it wonderful?
And then
I love old buildings. That's
Yeah.
a good one.
I included the Beers map below in the inset, shows the house too, as Forsyth Hotel. The October image is more or less the same, from the same vantage point, taken by B.F. Payne. It shows Route 9B, and what's interesting is that picture there, the road, if you look closely, and you compare it to the photograph I took just recently, the road turns today. It makes a sharp right and goes over the railroad tracks. That's recent. Originally, it went straight, as you can see, and combined with the road that's now a dirt road behind a little tiny house. And you would just drive over the railroad tracks then. But you can see the roads are quite small and windy and very rough.
When you go across roads, and Calvin and I were heading down to cover the Crown Point Bridge story very recently, as we're recording this in November 2011, we wondered whether it started as a cow path or a game path or what. Some of these roads, you wonder how they first
started. A lot
started.
of these roads were like either Indian trails or, then picked up by the settlers, or, there's a lot of information where there was a highway commission in the town of Champlain, late 1700s, early 1800s, and they're proposing, putting a road in, and I've seen letters about that, and putting in the bridge in Coopersville, around 1800 or so.
Where did you find that guarantee for the skis down here?
Yeah, that's a lot of different material that's owned by the Clinton County Historical Association, and they also have some material that was the McClellans.
That's from the 1940s. That's kind of neat to run across something
and the
like that.
Breedenbergs, ran a ski factory up on Butternut Street, and that's what this, the tag is about.
I love it. All right.
Yeah.
Let's
November.
go to November.
We're at Perry's Mills, and that's the Perry Mills Road. Last year's photograph was taken of that same spot, looking west. This is looking east. Over to the right is B.F. Payne's car, and that's how I know it was taken by him.
Oh my goodness. Isn't that amazing?
And I zoomed in, and the other photograph actually shows Payne, a bunch of people walking around looking at the car, because back in the old days, at that time, they were a novelty, so not a lot of people really saw these cars.
Well, his car certainly got some got some press in his
Yeah.
photographs.
And
you,
of course,
you suppose he did that on purpose?
oh yeah, I think he was very proud of his car because he was very big into cars, and he always would put a picture of his car in these photographs.
Yeah,
Yeah.
because you mentioned this either in the last time we came here or the time before,
Yeah.
and so now it's fun,
Yeah, this one here, December, actually shows the Payne studio on Main Street, the little house. It was in the 1950s called Ma Dupuis' house.
Ma Dupuis?
Ma Dupuis.
I love it.
Yeah, and Celine Paquette remembers it as that. And actually, I have a picture of that house in the inset at the bottom on the next page. But, Payne had, several studios. He was in this house here in 1909, 1910, and before that he was in that Doolittle building I mentioned before.
Oh, look at this.
But what's interesting is here you look at the picture, the sign that says Eastman Supplies, Edison Phonographs, and local postcards. And you can't see it in this picture here, but I can see it on my computer. Is if you look in the window, you can see hundreds of postcards on the wall.
Come on. You could see that?
Well, you have the detail, and
That's
and those
absolutely
postcards
amazing.
are now all over the country, and you find them on eBay, etc., and right here. But anyway, that's his car right there. That's one of his other cars, and I'm sure the two girls there, and maybe a friend, the two girls are probably his children, and they're holding a cat.
Oh, I said that.
And the building to the left is still present today. It's 2 stories instead of 3. He was also into he was a taxi service. So as you said, auto for hire. And in my history, I write that someone was interested in working for him to be the chauffeur, which was basically a taxi driver. And they drive people around town over to Vermont, down to Plattsburgh, in these old cars. And it was probably better in the car than it was by horse,
Yeah. Just while we have a moment, let's talk just for another second about the Samuel de Champlain History Center that Celine has. Is it open on a regular basis for tours?
It's open, I think weekly, but you have to contact her to make an arrangements because it's basically her here. So you have to make sure that she, her schedule lines up with when you want to come.
That's
so
wonderful
it's
dedication.
best to call her and make arrangements for a tour.
All right. We finished the year.
What's the number?
What? Oh, the telephone number? Yeah. What is the telephone number?
I think it's like
here?
298-1609. Yeah.
Is it 1609?
Yeah,
What
1609.
else would it be, knowing
Yeah,
Celine? That would be
1609
wonderful.
is when Champlain,
Of course.
sailed down the lake.
That's where it started. I wonder if he had any idea what he was gonna. We love to look into the future. We also love to look into the past. But this whole thing of Samuel de Champlain's trek down through this area and through
Yeah,
our
the
lake
lake,
was
yeah.
so significant
Well,
for us.
I don't think definitely didn't go through the village of Champlain, but I know he certainly passed off Rouses Point.
Who knows where they foraged? I don't know if they came ashore here. We know they came ashore on the other side of the lake, up around this neck of the woods, but who knows? Anyway, we're going to talk about the town of Champlain's lost burying yards. This is something how long did it take you to write this,
Well,
did you say?
I was saying earlier, I spent most of the winter, starting around December through May, actually compiling a larger document and putting these maps together and pictures, and I do a lot of annotations on these maps where we're trying to figure out how things have changed. One of the things I do pretty considerably is I have a lot of these old aerial photographs, and I'm able to take the photographs, superimpose them on the old maps, and then you do a transparency, make one transparent, and then you can get a very good outline of where things are, and you can trace it out and find where things are, in today's perspective.
That's a great thing, is that once again I'll hark back to Keith Herculow trying to find the exact and proper location for Pike's Cantonment.
Yeah.
And we've seen those transparencies work in so many different ways, where you try
Yeah.
to get things together and bring it up to the present time.
Well, what's nice is you got the Beers map, 1869. You have another map, 1857, and then you have the USDA aerial photograph, 1948, which really shows not much change from the previous 100 years, but starting probably in the 60s and 70s, we've had a lot of development around town. A lot of things have changed. So these old aerial photographs really show how things were, in today's perspective. But again, not much had changed between 48 and 1848.
You know that I write ghost stories, and we talk about it all the time. And there are people who would say, "Oh, they're talking about graveyards and burying yards. That's a macabre subject." But it's actually a great place to study history, isn't it?
Well, because people lived and they're someplace today. And, for example, I can look at if you go to Maple Hill Cemetery, or the Perry's Mill Cemetery, you see all these names, and all these names are on the Beers maps, and it's a who's who of these maps. And, these people lived in the mid 1800s. And they live their houses may still be around, but they're buried and still in town. So
you have I don't know how you remember all this stuff. Did you have to bone up before you came here today?
No, I didn't. I did.
You had it right there,
didn't
didn't
do
you,
any
David?
prep because I was working on this just not more than 2 weeks ago, so it's still fresh.
Who prints it for you?
Border Press prints it.
Of
for me.
course.
And they've been printing
And
the
aren't
last.
they wonderful people?
They've been printing the last all 10 calendars for me.
It's actually been a wonderful thing for Calvin, for some of his personal projects and history projects and various things, to have the Rochesters and the Border Press to be a part of our community.
Yeah, they do a really good job.
And to go in there, and I'd love to look at their collection of the old McClellan stuff and the old printing supplies and
they do a really good job at printing these calendars, and it's a lot of effort. Even after the layout is done, you have to print them and bind them and drill holes in them and trim them. So it's a lot of work, doing that. Just printing them out.
Yeah, so we gave them a little shout out, and that's a good thing, because they're really, really good people. So talk a little more about these, about your quest and these.
So anyway,
burying.
what I found was, we there's definitely, we have several burying yards around town that everyone knows about. Glenwood, Maple Hill, the two St. Mary's cemeteries, Perry's Mills, Chute Cemetery, off on McRae Road. And they're all well established, maintained by the, either the associations or the towns. And then I found there's obviously a lot more out there, some completely gone, and some are abandoned and forgotten about. So we'll just go down a list here and
By all means.
and talk about the different, where these different burials are and et cetera. The first one was Joseph Rowe, and Joseph Rowe was the earliest settler, one of the earliest settlers that we had here. He came up around Pliny Moore's time, and he was only here a year, and he died. I don't know what he died of, but he died in 1789, and he owned the lot 65, which is where South Street and Church Street is today. It's on the corner where the direct subs used to be, etc. And I found information that he was buried on the side of a hill. It was thought that he was buried under the quote unquote highway. Well, the highway is really just Church Street today. It was going out toward Ridge Road, and the hill is probably the St. Mary's, cemetery is built on a small hill. So my guess is, he was probably buried around that intersection, within 20, 30 feet of it, and he's probably he's surely still there, but no one ever really known it until we bring out this information. The next that was just a single burial, and he had a wife, and she sold the land later on, And the next, the oldest burying ground in the village, official burying ground, is the old burying yard on Oak Street. That's where John Rowe's house is today, as well as the house north of him. And that was given by Pliny Moore, 1799, when a cousin of his wife died, and so he gave 1 acre of land. And it was basically the burying ground for the village of Champlain up until 1859. And then everyone was basically dug up and moved to Glenwood Cemetery. I'm not really sure how many cemeteries or how many graves were there. But the person of interest is a guy named Richard Caldwell, who was from the War of 1812, American soldier who came up from Plattsburgh, and he was very sick, delirious. He lasted only a few days, November 1812. He had typhus, which is spread by lice, and the lice bite you, and you get the disease. And a lot of the soldiers had that. He had it. He was cared for at a house up on Prospect Street where he died, and then he was buried in the old burying ground, and then later moved to Glenwood, which we'll talk about later. So what I found was actually some good information about his when he died, and his brother wrote a letter to Pliny Moore, a year or two later, asking the particulars of his death, and Pliny was able to give him some details of even what this person said before he died, and what his condition was. So the old burying yard is the oldest burying yard in the town, or in this village here, and it's no longer present. Another person that was buried there, we'll talk about later, is Benjamin Forsyth, who was killed 1814 up on Route 276 near the border, and he was shot by an Indian on the New York side, not on the Canadian side. He was buried in the back section of the cemetery in an unmarked grave, and being that it was unmarked, 70, 60 years later, 1870s, when they moved the cemetery, he was never found. So he was actually up there, probably behind their house someplace, or on the side of the house. No one knows where. So, and those are that's the old burying yard in town, and there's a historic plaque showing the site of the burying yard in front of the Rowe house. The other cemeteries were St. Mary's Cemetery on Prospect Street. That was established 1860.
Just show this. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, and then in 1910, another cemetery, St. Mary's Cemetery, was established, and in the first cemetery, 1940, they had 648 people buried there, and in the newer one, they had 635 people buried there. In Rouses Point, we had several burying grounds, and what was interesting is a lot of them are not present today, and some were moved, some disappeared. So anyway, the Aaron Scott Thurber burying ground, was, I believe his house is still present. It's one of the bigger houses on Lake Street there in Rouses Point, and there were it was a small family burying ground, and the first English person to die in Champlain, or in the Rouses Point area, was Abigail Thurber, who died 1797, and she actually lived with her husband at the old fort on Point-au-Fer before moving to Rouses Point. And so she died at age 58, 1797, and she was buried, I believe, in the cemetery, and she has two stones. One's the smallest stone, which I don't see in the picture here, and then there was a larger one. Her husband died, so that may be the oldest gravestone in the town.
Aha.
Being that maybe it's buried, I don't know, but it's 1797. Now, 1823, Ezra Thurber, and there was a ton of Thurbers up and around Champlain, all over the place. It was, there was a lot of sons, and then they married. So I think Edward was the first Thurber, the older one. So Old Burying Ground 1823 was actually established um, literally across the street, across Elm Street from Angelo's Pizza there. And you can clearly see it in the Beers map. Fairly large cemetery, and it had about 64 people buried there in the 1870s. And that was the official Rouses Point Cemetery, sort of out of town, if you could think about it, because the town was basically along the lakeshore. So, where Angelo's Pizza is today is right across the street from it. Another cemetery was probably the Oliver's Ground Cemetery, and that was Andrew Oliver, and he owned the entire lot 57, which goes from Chapman Street to State Street, and going way back, way out of town. And he had a house nearby, and I believe, in the Beers map it shows where his house was, and there was a cemetery there, and he's buried there along with his son-in-law and probably some children. And his son, another Andrew, was actually buried in Maple Hill Cemetery. So someplace around there is the burying ground, but right now there's a lot of houses. It's a developed area, but the 1840s, 1830s when people were buried, this was all field, because keep in mind in 1806 there was only about 6 houses in Rouses Point. Champlain was actually the bigger village. Joseph Bindon Graveyard is another one. He was a soldier who served in the Revolutionary War and had a house up on Route 276, which in Rouses Point. I guess it's Church Street or so. And you can see where his house was in the maps. He was probably buried someplace behind his house,
Sure.
which is, from what I can gather, is field and where the railroad tracks were. Where he was, who knows today, but I'm sure he's there someplace, probably with his wife and who knows else. But his son, Joseph Jr., is buried in Maple Hill Cemetery. Because again, Maple Hill Cemetery was established 1859. So a lot of the children of the earliest settlers were buried, in the more established cemeteries, whereas the first people were buried more or less a stone's throw away from their house.
Yeah.
The Weeks Graveyard in Rouses Point is right next to the old plant there, and the Wyeth plant. And I don't know who's there or not, but I know Mrs. Ross around 1979 made sure that it was preserved. The site was preserved. Then you have the Weeks Graveyard, which I mentioned about, the St. Patrick's one. Cemetery 1859 is in Rouses Point. It's the Catholic cemetery up on Church Street. And then we go to Coopersville, and we have probably one of the oldest Catholic cemeteries, official Catholic cemeteries in town. And that was established, 1823 or so. And it was built next to the St. Joseph's Church. And previous to that, a lot of the settlers were either buried on their, homesteads, farms, or in the refugee burying ground, which I will talk about in a few minutes. But the St. Joseph's is the official, the first Catholic cemetery, and then later on you had St. Patrick's and St. Mary's, which were 1859, 1860. So Perry's Mills has a number of cemeteries. The Perry's Mill Cemetery was, I think it's a public cemetery, it's established 1840, and a lot of people from, that you see in the Beers map from Perry's Mills, you find the names in that cemetery. And I assume this is maintained by the town of Champlain. A lot of people there. And 1941, 126 people were buried there. The Murray gravesite, it's not too far away. It's on the road going to Canada, the Clark Road. Hugh McClellan saw one stone that in the 1930s or so, 40s, had been, half the stone was on one side of the road, the other half was on the other side of the road.
Oh my.
So, and this is, again, a long time ago, and 1941, and it's not really clear where the cemetery was. The USGS map shows the location of it. Not really sure who's buried there besides the person that he found the stone for, but it could be one person or it could be a whole family there. And some of the Murrays are also buried in Perry's Mills. Another cemetery that Hugh McClellan had transcribed in 1935 was what he called the French Protestant Cemetery, which was on Fry Clark's land, and that's at the corner of where Cardin Road and Dubois Road meet, and there was several houses there, and there's some farms there today. Supposedly the graveyard wasn't too far away from the farm. That's actually one graveyard I haven't found yet. It's on my list to do, but I'm sure it's around, and I'm sure the owner of the property may know where it is. The next one is Chutes Graveyard, interior to the town, and Chutes is one of the older ones in the town. That's 1802, and a lot of people are buried here, and it says 156 people buried in around 1943, and a lot of Revolutionary War soldiers are buried here.
Ooh.
You have Moses Moores. Moses was the brother of General Benjamin Moores, and their uncle was Hazen, who commanded the Canadian military, or the Canadian soldiers who fought on the U.S. side. And Antoine Poland is buried here. He was born 1737, died 1813, and he served in the French and Indian War and as well as the Revolutionary War. And then you have some War of 1812 soldiers, William Churchill, Darius Churchill, Lemuel North, Reuben Stetson, Robert Stetson, and then Ebenezer Cooper, whose name was given to Coopersville, is buried there with some of his family. So I've seen it. It's it was restored some years ago by, I think, a descendant of someone. The next one is the Heyford burying ground. That was 1809. It was a quarter-acre size, and it was organized. It was laid out by Isaac Heyford on his farm, and had a lot of stones there and a lot of bodies buried there. But we found out later that some of the bodies were moved, or at least the stones, we don't really know what happened, were moved probably in the 1870s to Maple Hill. Problem is, other stones are still in the plot. And when Hugh saw the cemetery in 1937, almost all the stones were broken and fallen down. I've actually seen pieces of the stones, so it's still, the cemetery is still there, and it's been cordoned off again from the rest of the field, so it won't be plowed. But it's in an active field that's planted. The next one is the Charles Moore ground. That's where the Honey Moore intersection is there, and I should say it's Honey Moore, Moore, not Mooers,
Yes,
as
of
the
course.
sign
Yeah.
shows on the
Well,
road.
yeah. Don't
And
believe everything
and
you see.
yeah, and it's named because of Asa Moore. Early 1800s was a beekeeper, so and that's why it's called Honey Moores. And unfortunately, so anyway, then there's the Charles Moore graveyard, which is no relation to Pliny Moore. There was a number of different Moore families in town, and that cemetery is way back behind some trailers near a little stream, and I've seen it, and it's still intact. It's about the same condition as it was when Hugh saw it in the 1930s. Some stones are falling down, some are still up, but the town cuts the grass, I think, once or twice a year. Rogers Burying Ground, that's where this the Rock Hill Farm is. That was Elnathan Rogers owned that property. Elnathan was the brother-in-law of Pliny Moore. Came up with Pliny 1788, married Pliny's daughter, sister, and they had a house there. Across the street was another Moore family, not related to Pliny, and supposedly they had some family burying grounds. And everyone now is in Glenwood Cemetery,
Yeah.
or at least the stones. We'll talk about that in a minute.
Okay.
The next big one is the Dewey Family Cemetery, 1812. And, I do the ceremony at Dewey's Tavern every year. And Dewey's Tavern was on the road to Canada. Elias Dewey came 1797 and built the main tavern in 1800 and then an addition after. And Louis Bedard and his wife Rita live there today. And they've restored the house to its original condition. Back some time ago, early 1900s, there was a cemetery there that contained the Dewey family, and we also know from records from the War of 1812 that American soldiers are buried someplace in the cemetery or nearby, and possibly British soldiers from the War of 1812. Around 1909, the farmer that owned the property probably moved the stones. There's always been local legend that the farmer had expanded his cemetery or his field into the cemetery. And what I found out was the granddaughter of the last owner of the Dewey owner of the property moved all the stones to Glenwood Cemetery in 1909. And she bought a plot there, but she's buried in Plattsburgh. So she just bought the plot for the stones.
Ah.
Now I'm pretty sure there's a few burials like her parents, which they had died maybe 20 years before, 1880s, are probably buried in Glenwood, but all the other stones are only a few inches apart. And you aren't really sure if there's bodies there or, because, people would have died 100 years before, or to 50 years before. So it's hard to say if everyone was dug up. We don't know where Elias and his wife Lovisa are, because they had no stones or the stones were moved. But in any case, I believe that there's definitely still, Deweys in the old cemetery, and there's definitely American and British soldiers there. And the town of Champlain, with the help of Calvin Castine, acquired the property, and the town now owns the property, the 12 acres where the cemetery was or is today.
It's always been my feeling, based on what you all have said and other people have told me before that there are bodies buried there.
Yeah.
There are bones in that field. You feel that way too, Calvin, don't you?
Yes,
Yeah.
and we can't thank Louis and Rita enough for making it available.
Oh, just wonderful. I ran into him at our harvest dinner at St. Alexander's Church this past Sunday as we're recording this on the 15th day of November 2011. And I always thank them every time because they're great people, and that was a wonderful thing that you got that done over there.
And every year they host the little commemoration ceremony that we have that starts the Battle of Plattsburgh.
The three of us in this room feel very strongly about that spot, don't we?
Yeah, we do. It's one of the most historic sites. I know Alan Everest said that the house was probably the most historic house in the Clinton County.
Well, that says something.
Because,
It's a
you had
highly esteemed historian.
You had so many armies camped, British and American armies camped all around there. You had 2 prisoner of war treaties, negotiated at the tavern during the War of 1812, and it was a lot of activity occurred there.
There have been a lot of movies, now some significant television shows on both sides of the Canadian border about the War of 1812, and specifically the battles of Plattsburgh, have never given enough due to that particular spot.
Yeah.
And I've made it part of my itinerary when I bring people from out of town to drive past Dewey's Tavern and say, take a good long look at it and try to imagine what it was like.
And what's interesting about the tavern and the house is it hasn't really changed much in 200 years.
That's the best part of it.
And the original log cabin is behind the house.
I'd like to pause for just a moment and we'll settle on the way we're going to wrap up this wonderful program with David Patrick in the History Center right here in Champlain. Well, David, we have a plan. We've got a lot to cover. We've got
Yeah.
about 10 minutes to do it in. So what's
Yeah.
next?
So the next one was Sweet Cemetery. Very small cemetery, 1846 on the Rapids Road. And then I don't know where it is. The stones are probably around someplace. The next one is the Enger'family Cemetery. That was on the corner of Mason and Leggett Road. And the Pettinger farm is still present. It's a large brick house. And there used to be a small family cemetery directly behind the house. And the stones were moved to Glenwood Cemetery. Yet the person writing a letter I found, a descendant, said only a few bodies were moved. And he's
Once
sure that there's a number of people buried still
Yeah.
on the farm.
Yeah.
Of course, no one today who owns the farm would even know the cemetery is there. But the previous owner, named Kupel, knew about the cemetery in the 1960s. Western half of town, we got the Fry Clark Burial Ground, which is just one stone, one burial on Beaver Creek there. Very, very nice area. It was an area that he probably liked quite a bit. His wife was buried in Perry's Mills. The Downs Graveyard, established 1826, and it's still present. And there's a War of 1812. Soldiers are buried there. It's a small little hill. You can see it from the road, surrounded by field. Then the Baker's Burying Ground, which there's no trace of it, but there's probably Baker's someplace on someone's property. I don't know where. I know it's on Ridge Road, near Matot Road. And then the Waters Graveyard, which is well established. On the lakeshore area, there's a Joseph King Burying Ground, of which Kings Bay is named after. And he owns some property. A number of people are buried there. Definitely people are buried there. And it's behind someone's house in the 700, 800 block, wherever his house might have been. His son lived in town, but he moved back to Vermont when his wife died, like 1809. So, or 1812, I think. So anyway, there's people there in Kings Bay off Route 9B, but we don't know where. And Rochester Family Cemetery, the Rochester's a border press. Their ancestor is buried someplace in the field, along with John Walker, who was a customs agent during the embargo times, 1808, 1809 period. One of the most historic burying grounds in town is the Refugee Burying Ground, and I kind of rediscovered it just this past April, even though a few people knew about it. Francis Lauren owns the property today, and when I started calling around, I talked to several people. I talked to his brother Walter, who said, "Oh yeah, there's a cemetery across the street from my house." So we immediately went up there, and moved. You could not see anything, and I moved the sod and the grass, and sure enough, I was able to uncover 7 stones, of Joseph Ashline and a number of other people. Well, this cemetery is the cemetery where Jack Rouse is buried, along with
really?
along with his wife,
Wow.
her wives, and some of his children, because that's on the farm, his farm. They said he was always buried on his farm near the town of Champlain, the Chazy town line, and that's the refugee burying ground. So, before St. Joseph's Cemetery was established, you had this burying ground, which is actually on a high spot, and then it slopes down to the lake. And Francis remembers the cemetery with a fence around it in the 1930s, but some bulls knocked the fence down, and then the stones have been moved around. But he remembers it as about 60 by 60 feet wide. However, that's 1937, but people were buried there 1820s. Rouse died around 1820. So who knows how many people were there, 50, 100 people, I don't know, but it's the earliest French refugees, that lived in town, and very historic site. Would like to see a blue and yellow plaque put up at some point, and maybe even the area marked off with a fence. Just the established stones, the stones that are present. There's definitely 7 or 8 stones, and that are present today. I've seen several of them. To the south is the Wiley burying ground, which is actually in Shazy, and still well maintained by. I think the Wiley family still owns it, but the refugee burying ground is very important.
Wow, yeah.
And then you have the establishment of flipping the page, the 2 municipal cemeteries. You have Glenwood Cemetery and Maple Hill, established 1859 and 1858. At the time, there was a movement during that time period to establish municipal cemeteries that were owned by an association. They were established, and money was given, and land was donated or bought. And then in the 1870s, 13 years later, laws are passed by the state of New York to move everyone in these older cemeteries, like the one on Oak Street where John Rowe's house is, and the other one and other cemeteries to this cemetery. So a lot of people around town were dug up, moved to these municipal cemeteries, and but we don't know if their stones are moved or the bodies are moved. The next most important one was the Point of Fur Revolutionary War site, which we dedicated in 2009. We probably have 160 soldiers buried there, on the lake shore, and a small site was established in 2009 with a historic plaque, and it shows the original DAR plaque that was established there in 1930. And then I also talk about some other mass graves sites in Champlain, where the War of 1812, which we've talked about, where a lot of people died of typhus. And then, of course, during the battle in Lacole in 1814, they were buried in Dewey's Tavern, and among other places. And then there was a cholera burial site someplace on the Commons. And anyway, the McClellans spent 20, 30, 40 years
What's that family for the work they did?
Yeah.
They laid the groundwork for everything.
chronicling
Oh,
cemeteries.
my goodness.
And their information is in the cemetery transcriptions, which are at special collections, the Samuel D. Champlain History Center, and a lot of local libraries. And a lot of this work here is based on their work, back from 1917 to the 60s, where they updated it. And so anyway, a lot of this material I present here is based on their information, Hugh McClellan and Woody McClellan's material.
This is the back of the calendar. We only have a couple of minutes to go, and we've only been allowed by the restrictions of time to spend a little bit of time.
Yeah.
David Patrick, this is his baby.
Yeah.
It's almost like having a baby
Yeah.
here to put something together like this.
Yeah. And like I said, you can get them at the Town and Village office, Kinney Drugs, Cornerstone Drug in Rouses Point, the one in Plattsburgh, the Cornerstone Bookstore in Plattsburgh, Conroy's Organics, Chauvin Insurance Company, Champlain Memorial Library. So there's a lot of places in town here in Champlain. Clinton County Historical Association and Kent Dillard House will also have them too.
We don't expect everyone watching this program, wherever they might be, to become as passionate about history as David Patrick or even Calvin Castine or Gordy Little. Well, we hope we have generated enough interest so that you study further on any of the topics of this calendar, anything else to do with the history of Champlain, Rouses Point, Coopersville, Perry's Mills, or your own community, wherever it might be. Because of all those things you remember hearing about history, you're doomed to repeat it if you don't study it. So you better know where you came from. and it makes you feel better. It gives you, one of my favorite words is perspective. So study a little bit of history, get a perspective of where you're standing and who might have been standing there, 200 years ago,
Yeah.
250
And
years
Champlain
ago.
has a lot of history here.
Just wonderful.
I'm just trying to
massively
bring
good
it out,
history.
year by year.
I salute you.
Yeah, thanks.
If I had a hat, I'd doff my hat to you, David Patrick, for what you've done. Congratulations to you and all the other people who study history, who teach history, who just like to read about history. Get your copy of the 2012 Town of Champlain Historic Calendar, Historic Essay, the Town of Champlain's Lost Burying Yards. I shake your hand, young man.
Thank you.
You've done a masterful job. I thank all of our listeners wherever they are, because we never fail to get comments about every one of these programs. Each one of these programs, like your calendar, David, is a piece of history, and thank goodness they're being archived on the internet at Plattsburgh.com and HometownCableNetwork.com, available on various local cable channels. So we appreciate your comments by email, by telephone, in person on the street, and my wife hates it when we go grocery shopping because it takes me 2 hours to talk to people who say, hey, I like that show that you and Calvin, I really like that one with David Patrick last week. So do that. Send us your comments and suggestions. Write out a generous check and send it to Calvin Castine in care of Hometown Cable on the Ridge Road, Champlain. And who knows where we're going to be next time for our little corner.